Well, welcome to today's webinar on how to do multi-site better. My name is Sean, one of the consultants here at the Unstuck Group, and your host today. And today we're going to get specific on the proven strategies that lead to better results for churches that choose to multiply through multi-site. But before we get into today's content, let me take a second and introduce the other panelists that are here with me today. First of all, we have Tony Morgan. Tony, of course, is the founder and lead strategist here at the Unstuck Group. We started back in 2009, and over that time, the Unstuck Group has served more than 600 churches now throughout the United States and several other countries around the world. Tony, you've helped to build and launch multi-site strategies at literally dozens of churches. So as you think back in that journey, what stands out to you about your multi-site growth and experience?
Yeah, so it's hard to believe, but actually now we've served over 100 multi-site churches through the years. But my journey with multi-site really goes back to my time when I was on staff, full-time pastor at New Spring Church in South Carolina. And way back when, New Spring was just single location in Anderson, South Carolina. And I helped, obviously it was a team effort, to launch our first locations in Greenville, in Columbia, in Florence. And so that was a fun season. Needless to say, it was early on back then for multi-site churches. And through the last now close to 15 years at the Unstuck Group and working with all those multi-site churches, we've learned quite a bit of what works and what doesn't work. And so I'm looking forward to today's conversation with that in mind.
Yeah, absolutely. And we also have Amy Anderson here with us today. Amy is the director of consulting here at the Unstuck Group and has been in that role since 2016. And during that time, she's served personally over 200 churches, helping them to design ministry, staffing, and even multi-site strategies that align and fuel their mission together. So, Amy, you've served with dozens of multi-site churches as well. What stands out to you as you just reflect back personally?
Yeah, well, first off, I'm just so glad we have so many ministry leaders joining us today. Tony, kind of like you, and I reflect back over my own multi-site leadership journey back in the early 2000s. We just didn't have very many churches or leaders to look to for wisdom on our multi-site model. But trying things and making big mistakes was a huge wisdom builder for us. And the good news is that we're all more learned now about multi-site. We have data. It's not a new thing anymore. So I'm just excited to show and walk through the better ways of doing multi-site that have been discovered over the past 15 years.
Yeah. So, Amy, why are we talking about this today? Why is this the right conversation for right now?
Yeah, well, Sean, we did a webinar about this same time last spring. And at that time, it was triggered by all the stories we were hearing as more and more multi-site churches were struggling with the negative outcomes, of their multi-site model, maybe of COVID, and wondering just, should we consider, continue with our multi-site model or should we unmulti-site? But this year, we're hearing from more and more churches who want to go multi-site really for the first time. And we're excited to talk through kind of the better ways of multi-siting. And we're hearing from churches who are already multi-site that they're more than ever, they're more committed to this strategy now. So that was a big prompt for us to pull this multi-site webinar together.
Yes. And Amy, let me just add, we went and looked at a lot of data in the first quarter of this year. And this may or may not be a surprise to you, but 1 in 5 churches is now multi-site, and more than 60% of churches that average 1,000 people or more in attendance, they're now multi-site. Now, that's not to suggest that multi-site churches are no longer having challenges. And really, that's why we're doing the webinar today with more churches doing multi-site or considering going multi-site. We want to help you with some strategies that we know are going to help you experience the health and success you want to experience with your multi-site strategy. Because we know if we don't approach multi-site the right way, there are some predictable outcomes that you might experience. And we want to help you avoid maybe some of the challenges that other churches have experienced when it comes to their multi-site strategy.
Yeah, so for everybody who's watching today, here's the decision that we want you to make. Our goal for this webinar is to convince you to commit to taking at least one key next step to better your multi-site strategy before the next school year. So before we get to August, September of next year, what's that one key step that you're going to take to better your multi-site strategy? And we're going to walk through this conversation and approach it in kind of 3 different steps. Step 1 is choosing the better model, looking at multi-site models, making sure that we're choosing the better model. Step 2 is making changes for better results. And then step 3, overcoming common multi-site mistakes. So just a few last details before we get into the content. Of course, in today's webinar, we have chat and live Q&A going. Chat is off to the side. If you have comments, banter that you want to engage in, use chat for that. If you have specific questions for us, use the Q&A function. We'll be taking some of those questions for our live Q&A at the end of the webinar today, so submit your questions there. If you haven't yet downloaded the workbook that goes with today's conversation, you can get it at the unstuckgroup.com/workbook. So the unstuckgroup.com/workbook. Tiffany, Jordan, Tony, and Amy, myself will be interacting via chat today and helping to identify those questions that we'll be using later in the live Q&A. For any that we're not able to get to live, we'll try to use those to influence some of our follow-up content in the days after today's webinar. And of course, you can share today's conversation online on social media. Just use the hashtag UnstuckChurch on Twitter and Facebook, okay? All right. So step 1, choosing the better model. We're going to start here. You know, it may not be popular, but it's true. There are some multi-site models that work better than others. And this has become even more clear in the last few years. Some really well-known churches have opted to unmulti-site. Some have had leadership implosions. Some find themselves shutting down campuses that never really became self-sustaining. But there's also churches that have continued to open new locations and are reaching hundreds, sometimes thousands of new people with the gospel every week. So let's dive into a conversation about the predictable outcomes of the various models of multi-site, and we can highlight which one is the better choice. Tony, would you like to get us started by just kind of sharing the multi-site spectrums exercise and how we use that?
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, this is really a good picture of what leads to some of those predictable outcomes that we talked about earlier. Because in this chart, you can see we take a look at how churches are identical and how they approach ministry in these different core ministry areas, and how they offer more autonomy and independence when it comes to these core ministry areas. And what we've seen is churches that really have a solid multi-site strategy, which then delivers the results that they're wanting to see related to their mission. The churches that lean more towards identical seem to be healthier in the long run than the churches that lean towards independent. And really, it's caused us to begin to, when we engage with churches around their multi-site strategy, to really drive to the fact that there's a key difference that we see in churches that are healthy and multi-site and those that are maybe experiencing some challenges. And it really goes back to the foundational question that we're asking from the very beginning. And what we see in healthy multi-site churches is they begin with this question: what do we have in common? So what do we have in common as it relates to our mission? What do we have in common as far as the people that we're trying to reach in our mission field? What do we share in common as far as the ministry strategy that we're engaging? In other words, they're beginning with from a position of unity and alignment. And because of that, they're able to move forward with strength throughout their ministry. It's interesting, though, the churches that seem to struggle once they get into multi-site begin with a completely different question. They usually begin with the question, what's different? So what's different about the people that we're trying to reach in this specific community? What's different about how we might need to teach in order to encourage this congregation, this specific congregation? What's different that may require us to adjust how we're approaching spiritual formation and so on. And so we have gone back to this core question of what do we have in common to really encourage churches to move forward with unity of purpose and alignment and then strength in their ministry model. And it's been fun to look back at some of the churches that have really embraced this through the years. I can just tell you one example, our good friends at Sun Valley in Phoenix. The team at Sun Valley, they're seeing hundreds and hundreds of people come to Christ, go public with their faith. And I think one of the reasons why their ministry strategy is working so well in this season is they really committed to that foundational question of, we have a common mission. So what do we have in common as far as our ministry model and our multi-site model are concerned in order to move that mission forward? And Sun Valley, now they're in 6 different locations throughout the Phoenix metropolitan area. And again, a lot of strength around that model. Then on the other side, I can just share, and there are several stories I could point to, but let me just talk about one particular church we worked with several years ago. Unfortunately, they started with the other question: what's different? What's different about our communities, who we're trying to reach, how we need to teach, or spiritual formation strategy. That church, when they called us in, it was to the point where they were going in so many different directions. It would have really been almost impossible for us to help that team get full alignment across all those locations again. And unfortunately, because of that, they went through a couple of church splits because they were just focused on, really, it came down to different mission, different strategies across the board. But fortunately, 3 of their 5 locations decided we're going to come back together. We're going to go back to that initial question of what do we have in common. And because of that, over time, they have also started to get traction again because now they've begun to embrace the identical side of that multi-spectrums chart. And in every one of those core ministry areas, they're trying to move forward. Again, it's unity of purpose. They're aligned. They're pulling together. Everybody's locked arms. They're all pulling together in the same direction. And now they're seeing the fruit of that alignment. So again, the question we need to wrestle with is, what do we have in common? And then from that, we can start to talk about all of those key strategic decisions and structure decisions that will not only bring the alignment, but ultimately the good news is it's going to bring the fruit of our ministry.
Yeah, Amy, let's take a minute just to kind of drill down on some of the real practical differences between multi-site and church planting. Because so often when multi-site ends up splitting a church, it's because the leaders were really treating campuses more like church plants in the way they structured things, even if they didn't realize it.
Yeah. So Tony, I took liberty. I hope you don't mind, but just to throw this visual up, when we talk about identical versus independence, when we think about multi-site churches versus church plants, there's some critical areas in there that really define which strategy we're taking. So for instance, on teaching, the highly identical model for healthy, growing multi-site churches is we have the same message at all locations. We have the same teacher, and it's typically done through video, through broadcast. When you get to church planting, we really have a different message that we're preaching there, right? We're not expecting that location to do the same message as we're doing. It's a different teacher, and often it's an in-person communicator delivering that message. When we look at mission field in a multi-site model, we're looking at the same mission field. So again, Tony, what Tony just said, what do we have in common? Who can we commonly reach? In church planting, they're really looking at a unique mission field. I could go through each of these, but let's just go to location for a minute. I mean, on location for a multi-site, if you're a multi-site church, you're going to bring a location where you already have people coming from. That way you've got your core, you can replicate some of these other areas like DNA, ministry model. But when you're a church planner, you're going, where's a community that needs a church? And so you're looking for this new community that you're going to plant in. And then of course, governance in a multi-site model, you've got one board structure over all of the locations. Or in church planting, if you're thinking, boy, that location needs its own church board, that's much more of a church planting mindset. Now, here's where multi-site church planting, either one of them gets messy, is when we try to live in this middle area. When we try to live in that, I call it the 5 through 7, maybe even 4 through 8, Mission field, for example. If you get muddy on mission field, well, you might have locations that are like, well, we need to have a different music style, or we need to teach on different topics because our mission field is so unique. Or governance, the messy middle sounds like this. Boy, we need representation from every one of our locations so that every location has a voice. Or there's confusion. We just worked with the church recently, and we had to work through, they had boards at every location, and those boards thought they had decision rights that maybe they shouldn't have had. And anyways, that messy middle just had a layer of complexity that really took away from the church's ability to move forward in a aligned way. So the better way is choose church planting and work that plan, or the better way is choose multi-site and work that plan. If you don't pick a side, if you try to live in that middle, that's where you're going to get multi-stuck. So that's the key difference, number one, between identical and autonomous. And then the second key area is really around the campus pastor or the teacher. When you have a multi-site model, when you have a church plant model, we all know that you need a go-getter, you need an entrepreneur, you need someone who's got tenacity to push through all the challenges of planting a church. When you're hiring a campus pastor, though, in a multi-site model, I love what Tony said on the podcast. First of all, the campus pastor has to be more vision carrier than vision creator. Again, that's getting out of the messy middle. Church planting, vision creator; multi-site, vision carrier. A campus pastor also needs to be more of a builder than an entrepreneur, because in a multi-site model, you're asking that campus pastor to implement the strategies that have already been created centrally that are being optimized at all locations. There is nothing more frustrating for a campus pastor or a central team when we have an entrepreneurial wired campus pastor. Just a wrong fit, not a bad person, not bad skills, just in the wrong role. If you're familiar with the working genius, a campus pastor is more galvanizing than invention, right? So we don't want campus pastors inventing a bunch of new things. Rather, we want a campus pastor to galvanize what's already been created to their congregation. We often say a campus pastor, their job description is to really compel their congregation to take their next steps in looking more like Jesus, whether that's accepting Jesus, whether that's serving in a leadership role, whether that's getting involved in group life. We need campus pastors to be more galvanizing than inventing. A couple more, campus pastors should be more empowering than controlling. And then the campus pastor should be more, and I love this one, Tony, you came up with this, I believe. They need to be more of a missionary than a preacher. Okay, they still need to be a great communicator, but they need to look at where God's placed their church and think like a missionary versus a preacher. And again, when this is muddied, when we try to, maybe have a campus pastor with some of those qualities of a church planter or vice versa, at least in multi-site campuses, they just start to fracture from one another because we've got the wrong kind of leader. And so you start to sense these splits. And again, the entrepreneur is frustrated. Central teams are frustrated with the entrepreneur. So the better way to bring all this down is when you're hiring a campus pastor or a church planner, be clear on what those job descriptions are. And by the way, the hiring and onboarding of a campus pastor, I just think it's one of the most critical hires a multi-site church makes. These leaders are highly visible. They're the primary leader of your multi-site location. And getting this wrong has steered many churches off course and they've gotten stuck. So one of our core multi-site conversations when we work with the church is we actually walk through, I think it's 9 or 10 or 11 success factors that every church needs to work through when they are hiring their campus pastor.
Yeah, Tony, it seems like a lot of churches understand these principles in the planning stage of multi-site, but then they end up compromising on some of the specifics as they get further into their multi-site journey. Location is a common one. Could you share a little more about how to stick with your model when you're choosing your locations?
Yeah, so let me just give a contrast here and Amy referred to this a moment ago, but there's actually two distinctly different approaches when we're launching a multi-site campus or location and church planting. This is actually one of the key differences where we see how we approach multi-site and church planting differ. Multi-site, as an example, you really do want to look at, and ideally it's a 20 to 30 minute drive time from existing locations. You look at kind of that circumference around your current locations, and you identify in that 20 to 30 minute drive time, where do we already have the most people connected to our church? That's how, if you're trying to choose a multi-site location, that's how you would go about it. Interestingly, church planters might look at a community and they're actually looking for where's the place where the fewest people are connected to a church. And because of that, obviously, we're going to approach how we launch a multi-site or how we launch a church plant a little bit differently. With multi-site, we're looking for that foundational core group of people that are going to be attending that location. But more importantly, these are the people that are going to be serving at that location, leading as lay leaders, as volunteer leaders at that location. And they're going to be the ones that are inviting all their friends and family and coworkers to hopefully take a step towards Jesus and connecting with the church in that new location as well. And that's why it's really important for us to do an assessment of the opportunities we have for launching new locations and make sure that the right core of people is there to help us to launch strong. Now, I've seen some examples, and I referred to a couple of these in a recent podcast, but one time I saw a good sized church. I thought they had a great multi-site strategy, but they just chose the wrong location because the location wasn't in that 20 to 30 minute drive time. It was actually closer to 5 minutes from their sending location. And as hard as they tried, I mean, they got the campus pastor right. They had the right multi-site strategy. They had the right launch strategy. But as you can imagine, as hard as they tried, it was so easy for people to move from the newer campus that didn't have quite the programming, quite the facilities, and so on back to the sending location. Likewise, I've seen churches that have launched too far away. And one church, as an example, in recent months, I think their campus was 90 minutes from where their original sending location was. And again, the challenge was there was an opportunity, but there weren't enough people in that community to launch strong in that community and to really be on mission in their daily lives to invite their friends and family to come take a step towards Christ and connecting with the church. And by the way, in both of these instances where I think it's pursuing opportunities that may not be in line with the mission and strategy that we're trying to engage. And usually those opportunities come because of maybe a merger possibility or a building that opens up. And I just want to tell you, just because there's a building or just because there's a church that reaches out to you and says, we'd like to merge with your church and for us to become a campus of your church, just because there's an opportunity like that doesn't necessarily mean that that's the direction you need to be going in order to accomplish the mission that God's called your church to. And mainly because when it comes to multi-site, we really do need to be paying attention to some of these principles of selecting the right location so that we can reach that community with strength.
Yeah, that's good. I think a lot of churches have learned sometimes those end up just being distractions rather than opportunities, right? Before we move on to the next section, we'd like to give you just a moment to reflect. Have you chosen the best model for multi-site? Are you borrowing strategies from multiple models right now? Identify just at least one point for conversation at the next meeting of your senior leadership team. We'll give you just a minute to reflect on that. All right, now step 2, considering changes for better results in our multi-site strategy. Churches that are multi-stuck often feel overwhelmed because they know something's broken, but they really aren't sure how to fix it. So Tony, could you share one of the tools we use as we help churches pinpoint what's specifically wrong?
Yeah, so let's take a look at this multi-site readiness checkpoints chart. And as you can see, it covers all these different categories that when we're on site working with the church, we kind of walk through with the church where they're healthy and where there are some opportunities for next steps. And so we'll go question by question, category by category. And this is a red, yellow, green exercise. So green means this area of our ministry right now is very strong, it's healthy. Yellow means there are some things that are working well, but there's still some opportunity for improvement. Red means either the strategies that we're engaging are not working, or we're not addressing this area at all right now, and there's a gap right now that exists in our ministry. And so, again, we'll go through each category with the ministry leadership team and just do an assessment of where we stand right now as a church, and are we prepared to either launch our first multi-site location, or for existing multi-site churches, are we prepared to launch our next location? And it's interesting, just went through this with another church and just in recent weeks. By the way, this church, great church, Indiana, the first church, and they're in DeMott, Indiana. And they're kind of blowing out all the expectations in that they're in two very rural communities and looking at a third rural Indiana community. And everybody always says video teaching won't work in my community. This church has recognized for us to stay aligned, we want everybody hearing the same message. And so they have a teaching team, and that team rotates who teaches every Sunday. But every location hears the same message from the same pastor every Sunday. And this church is growing in the season. They launched their second location right at the beginning of COVID. And now 500 people are showing up in rural Indiana for church every Sunday. But they're looking at their third location. And as we walk through the multi-site readiness checkpoint, it helped them clarify there were a couple of areas that had a little bit of yellow and red in them, where they recognized before we launch our next location, we need to shore up some of these. We need better systems in place. We need to make sure our structure supports this. We need to get these areas of our ministry healthy before we are prepared and in the best position to launch a third location. So it's our multi-site readiness checkpoint chart. And Sean, it really does. It helps us to identify those areas where some improvement is needed before we're ready to launch a new location.
So, Amy, we know that staffing structure and roles are one of the things that get most churches stuck when they go multi-site. So what are some of the changes that you coach churches to embrace to improve the results that they're getting?
Yeah, I think every multi-site church knows that we've always got this tension in the matrix of where does authority come from and where does influence come from. And if you've listened to any of our content, you've probably seen this visual before. When you have campus pastors and campus teams or who are trying to reach a community, we want to make sure we set up those teams where authority is coming through the campus pastor. But because we're a multi-site church trying to be one church in multiple locations, we have to recognize that there's going to be influence coming from these central leaders. So of course, it's just to be clear, who's the real boss, who's the second boss, and then how do we work through that together? But I thought for today's webinar, it might be helpful to actually see a structure from a multi-site church I worked with this last year. And as you look at this, it's a little messy. I think I've covered up all the names to protect the innocent, but you can see in this little box in the upper left corner with their org chart, they're trying to indicate through a direct report who has authority and through a double line there who has influence. But as you take in the whole of this structure, we have too complicated of a matrix here. So here's a couple problems they had. Number one, they had a campus pastor for the broadcast location. And honestly, they have 5 locations. You'd think we're ready for that role. Well, they probably were, but unfortunately, this person was locked down at the broadcast location, and then all the campus pastors reported into this leader. And you probably know the challenge, right? If he has a campus, in this case, it was a guy, he can't effectively lead the campus pastors because his focus is on rallying that broadcast location and being their pastor. The second challenge here is if you look at when they've grown and expanded through multi-site, again, looking up in the upper left, they had an executive team, a strategic team, a pastoral team. And that's actually a common mistake we see too, that as we kind of restructure around this new multi-site model, we keep too many teams in place. Sometimes it's so that we don't hurt someone's feeling, but it creates these levels of teams. Like in this case, what's different between an executive team and a strategic team? That really should be one team in there. But anyways, none of this was streamlined. As you look at this, there are no clear ministry lanes, and the span of care is really broad. And again, you get too many people to lead, and we lose focus on actually discipling and raising up leaders, in our care, and we end up just checking off management boxes. So as we work through this, you can look at this next visual. This is how we envision them going forward with multi-site. And in this case, you can see we added location pastors directly to the executive pastor. You also notice this is phase one. It's because we had to get rid of that broadcast location pastor being over everybody else. And so for an interim time, they reported directly to the executive pastor. And in this model, what we were also trying to do, number one, is identify the leaders over their core ministry strategies. And typically that's weekend, right? That's discipleship. It's family ministries, operations. In other words, they needed to clear up their lanes first so that everyone understood who are the leaders, who are the owners over these core ministry strategies. And then second, of course, the learning was don't put a campus pastor in place at the broadcast location until you get to about 4 or 5 campuses. This church happened to put that in place immediately, and it created a lot of complexity. We don't need to go there yet with a campus pastor until you're a little bit larger multi-site. And then the third would be, and by the way, let me just show you phase 2 here. We're trying to get to this for this church as they continue to grow. You can see that's when we're adding this multi-site director that actually gives direction to all the location pastors. So that was a destination. The counsel I gave this church, again, avoid creating all those multiple levels of leadership. You want one leadership team. And there's lots more I could talk through, but I thought it'd be helpful to kind of see where a church started and where it ends as they go through this multi-site staffing and structure process. Because although there's lots of other principles we could talk through, the fact is, Sean, every church is a little bit different, right? There's principles like the ones I've covered, but every church, based on their journey, where is God calling them, the size of their campuses, the ministry that they're working through, they kind of need a custom structure for their multi-site vision. But hopefully some of those principles will translate to kind of untangle maybe a little bit of what is tangled in your staffing and structure right now.
Amy, as you're talking through that, I kind of go back to, and this is a principle you've talked about for a long time now, how we need to identify our strategy and then our structure and then figure out what people fit into that structure. And I'm recalling several years ago working for a great church, large church too, and they launched into multiple sites, but they were so focused on staffing for their campuses they neglected their overall strategy. And one example of that was the fact that they didn't have a core leader over the weekend service experiences. And as a result of that, they had kind of lost some momentum around Sunday mornings because no one on the team owned that anymore. They were just so focused on leading their locations that no one owned leadership of Sunday mornings. And so it's just, again, a good example of, as you're talking through some of these variations of how churches structure for their multi-site model, we have to remember God's called us to a mission, and so we have a strategy, and then we build the structure around that, and then we find the people that will fit that structure.
Super helpful. We want to give everybody who's listening again a moment to reflect. And in your workbook, we left some circles for you to red, yellow, green, how you're doing in each of the multi-site readiness checkpoints. So we're just going to actually give you the next 20 seconds. And what I'd like you to do is take a moment and star the ones that you think might currently be red. Just put a star next to the ones you think might be currently red. And then take this exercise back to your next leadership team meeting and do the full exercise with them. So about 20 seconds. All right, now step 3 and our last step for today is overcoming some of the common multi-site mistakes. If you're going to do multi-site better, you have to avoid these common mistakes, the things that have been proven again and again to be really catastrophic to the success of this strategy. Tony, would you start us off by just sharing one of the most common mistakes that you see?
Yeah, well, let me hit a couple of them really quickly. Number one, Amy referred to this earlier. I think it's hiring the wrong leader. So launching with the wrong leader as the campus pastor. Second one, which I talked about a moment ago, was launching in the wrong location. And so we need to pay attention to some of those principles we've learned from other multi-site churches of what does that ideal location look like for launching a new campus, and remembering the location principle. Location is far more critical to the health and success of a new campus than the facility itself. But Sean, let me just take a moment just to talk about this third mistake that we see, and it's actually launching too fast. And it's always interesting to me once I get to a church and they're talking about launching a new location. Usually, the way the conversation plays out is this: the senior pastor wants that new location opened next week, and then the executive pastor commonly, or somebody like that, is thinking, I don't even know if we can do this in the next year. I think we're going to need longer. We're going to need more time to do this. And it's just a reflection of the strength that usually those two roles bring to any church ministry team. But the real answer is probably somewhere in between. And that's probably going to be a little bit of a disappointment, both to the senior pastor and to the executive pastor. But what I find is, especially for senior pastors, what they're thinking about, just two things really, is how soon can we get a building and get the building ready? And then secondly, how quickly can we get Sunday services up and running? And as long as those two things can happen quickly, they're trying to move the schedule as fast as possible because there's an urgency. There are people that we want to reach for Jesus in this new community, and we want to get into that community as quickly as possible. But the reality is, and we've done this enough times along the way to know, there's a lot of work that needs to be done to launch a healthy church in a new location, a healthy campus in a new location. And a lot of the time that's required really doesn't have to do with the building or the services. It has to do with the ministry teams that need to be built and the ministry leaders that we need to raise up to lead those different key ministry areas in this new church. I mean, really, it's probably would be the worst thing you could do would be to launch a service to attract a lot of people and then not be able to actually minister to people, to not be able to encourage people to take their next steps towards Christ, to not be able to care for people, because as you launch new ministry in a new community, you're going to have people that need help and they're looking for help, and we need to be in a place where we can minister to them and encourage them to take their next steps toward Christ. And that just takes time. And what I've seen is it takes time not only to build the teams for the new location, but very likely you're going to be taking volunteer leaders and volunteer team members from your existing locations to launch the new site, which means there's also some time that you're going to need to raise up new leaders and build new teams to support your existing locations as well. And so there are no shortcuts to that. You all know that it just takes time to find great leaders, to equip, to train them, to care for them, and then to empower them, release them to engage ministry. And that just takes time. And so you've maybe heard me say this before, and this is maybe especially an encouragement for senior pastors. I know you're looking at the mission God's called you to, and there are no shortage of communities that you could be going into to launch new campuses. And frankly, you may not even be short of financial resources to move into new locations. But where you're going to feel the biggest pinch if you don't invest more energy and time is around leadership. And you just need to make sure that you're constantly developing leaders, identifying leaders, equipping and releasing leaders to engage ministry, because that's the one barrier that will prevent you from opening new locations in the future. So that's maybe launching too fast, Sean, I think is one of the key mistakes that we've seen churches fall into. And so we just need to make sure we leave enough time to make sure the right leaders and the right teams are in place.
That's good. Amy, what are a few mistakes that you see?
Well, Tony, after listening to you, I think one of the big mistakes that churches can make is actually just launching too small. And so, we've heard, again, we've said for many years, go to the web, punch in multi-site, you'll see 100 different ways to do things. And there's been theories, like we're going to multiply like elephants or like rabbits. And, what you just made the argument for was we're going to be like elephants, right? This thing has to take a time to develop a healthy baby. But we also want a big baby, as much as you can to avoid launching too small. We often say the minimum core team that you need to have ready to launch with is 100 people. And if you have a core of 100 people who are going to go to that church, live in that community, serve at that church, we aren't looking for 100 people that go, I'll go there for 6 months. No, we want people who are invested in the community because like you said, Tony, the amazing part of multi-site is when you put your location closer to your attenders, they're much more apt to invite. So a core of 100 is a minimum. And then what you'd hope for is at launch, you'd have 200 people after the grand opening. And Sean, I'm just going to put up this chart that we use called Campus Teams and Leader, just to talk through the math of the bare minimum that you need to launch with. So if you're going to open up with 200 people at your grand opening, that means you need to have 72 volunteers in place, ready to serve day one, to lead the ministries. And of those 72, you actually need 15 of them to be higher level leaders, people who are leading other people or leading other leaders. And then with that, you get a staff team about 2.7 full-time equivalents, which of course, priorities there would go towards campus pastor, kids ministry, probably weekend worship and tech, how you'd use those. But if you have 200 people, you really shouldn't be staffing above 2.7 FTE. And then you need to build in the rest with your volunteer leaders and volunteers. So as I run those numbers, this is what I mean by you can't launch too small. When you launch a new campus, I've said it 100 times, this is your come and see location. So if you open with the bare minimum, and let's just say for a minute, the sending campus, again, we'd recommend sending campus isn't under 1,000 people. You need to get to 1,000 before you launch a new location. More is even better. That church has, it has a brand. It has an experience. It's something that people are drawn to. They're inviting to. If we launch too small, that new location isn't going to feel anything like the sending location. Therefore, all these people who just signed up to live, serve, give there, they aren't as excited about inviting new people to the campus if we launch too small. And it won't have that same come and see feel. But regardless, when you open a new location, it's going to be your come and see campus. And so people are going to invite. And if we drop the ball coming out of the gate because we launched too small, it just creates a lot of challenge that way. So that would be my caution. Make sure you've got a large enough core team in an area that's growing so that you can launch and replicate the church that's been healthy and growing.
All right. So as we wrap up today, again, just a reminder, the decision that we're hoping that you'll make is to commit to take at least one key next step to better your multi-site strategy before the new school year. So we're going to give you just the next 20 seconds. What I'd like you to do is just jot down one key next step that you should be considering. And then we're going to come back with some live Q&A and answer some of those questions you've submitted throughout today's webinar. All right, Tony, here we are live. If you're wondering, we do pre-record the content part of this because you've seen Tony answering a lot of your questions in chat. It allows us to be a lot more interactive when we pre-record that part. So, and we like that. So we do that, but here we are live together, ready to answer some of your questions. I thought it was a good conversation, Tony.
I thought so too, and a lot of good questions coming in. I saw, and so I'm looking forward to this. And unfortunately, I like to give Amy all the hard questions, but she was just coming back from California, working with another great church there today. So you're stuck with me today, Sean.
Yep. I like being stuck with you. That's okay. It's all good. I'll give you all the hard questions. So
that's right.
Let's start here. Nathan asked this. We are a current multi-site church, but as you would describe it, we are multi-stuck right now. How would you begin to address that to get everybody within the church and the leadership team on the same page?
Yeah, I really do believe it kind of goes back to we need to find alignment around our ministry model first, who we are as a church, our mission, how we engage our strategy, and then we can begin to shape the strategy we're going to specifically use for multi-site. But as you can imagine, and we alluded to it in our conversation earlier, you just can't look at strategy without also addressing structure. And that, I think, is one of the key reasons why churches end up multi-stuck is they have a sense of what they need to do as far as multi-site strategy is concerned, but then the structure isn't in place to support that. And so it's a combination of factors, but it really does, Sean, I think you need to go back and begin with looking at that alignment piece about who we are and how we engage our ministry strategy first, and then we can look at multi-site specifically.
Yeah, that's good. A lot of good questions, interesting questions about teaching model, which doesn't surprise us. We hear a lot of questions around that. This is a good one. Rob asked specifically, he said, we have a teaching team. We have the same message, but different speakers, I think he's referring live teachers. Can this be done in that identical model, or is this one of those stuck in the messy middle things?
Yeah. So by the way, when we work with the church around multi-site strategy, and as I mentioned earlier in today's conversation, now through the years, we've worked with more than 100 multi-site churches. We of course don't come in and force a church to only use video teaching. And we have through the years worked with a lot of churches that have said, really, no, we understand that that's what you recommend, but we're going to stick with live teaching. And in those instances, what we try to do then is help that team work as closely as possible so that they do make sure that their messages, really, it's more the voice of who they are as teachers stays unified. And that takes a lot of work to do that, but we've had churches that have said, no, we're committed to that. And then the other thing I would just suggest is if as an example, you've decided, it's only going to be one other location, so there will only be two locations. I do think it's possible in those situations to have separate live teachers at both locations. But I know a lot of churches get into multi-site and they're not just thinking two locations, they're thinking 3, 4, 5 on down the road. Yeah. And I will say it just gets harder and harder to scale to multiple locations like that if you don't consider using video delivery. So I hope that helps. I think it's possible. It just takes it takes a lot more work to stay aligned around teaching if you do commit to that live teaching model.
Yeah. The other thing I've seen, Tony, is typically if a multi-site church does move into that model for teaching, they've been doing multi-site for a long time already. This is not something that's new to them. Right. They're not trying to build new muscles. And so they can be a little more innovative, thinking maybe a little bit differently about other things, trying things, maybe failing. But I mean, certainly if you're early in your multi-site journey, we would caution you, maybe not something to begin with, right?
That's right.
Craig had a great question. He said, I've recently heard that a multi-site church has at least 4 sites, trying to read the question clearly, that you have that many, when you have 4 sites or until you have 4 sites, you're stuck in a hard place between implementing that identical versus independent model. What are your thoughts on this? Have you seen it to be true? Do you need to be 4 locations before you really move to that identical model?
Well, I would hope not, because the longer you try to do multi-site independently at your different locations, the harder in the long run it's going to be to bring alignment eventually. And so I will say, and what he may be referring to is, it feels like when churches open that third or fourth location is when just kind of the culture of the team and how the team operates, as it's as if now they are a multi-site team. And so rather than thinking single location centric, the original location kind of dominates how we approach ministry and decision making and things like that. When churches get to a third or fourth location, it just kind of becomes a part of who they are at that point. And so in some respects, this may sound crazy, but you get to a fourth location or more, the multi-site model almost becomes easier at that point. But the only way that it becomes easier at that point is if we try to start with alignment from the very beginning.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's good. David had a question about staffing, specifically around campuses. He said, we have 3 campuses and only a campus pastor as staff. Should we focus on next generation pastors, kind of students and kids? He said kids are running 200 at one location, 300 another.
Wow.
And they only have a central kids team right now. So just curious about, and I think what he's asking is kind of, when does that shift from only central support to when we have campus specific staff happen?
Yeah, so we normally recommend that we start building the campus teams from the very beginning. So as soon as you're launching that first new location, to start setting aside some of your staffing resources specifically for that new campus team. So it sounds like that may be an opportunity just to revisit structure again, which is what I alluded to earlier. It's one thing to commit to the multi-site strategy, but early on, you also have to begin to look at your structure as well to support that.
Yeah. Jeff asked, he said, we're a church of 500 and we really want to launch our first multi-site campus, but it seems that you don't recommend anything less than 1,000. Is that the ideal number, or is that a definite rule for success?
Yeah, well, rules are meant to be broken, isn't that? But no, seriously, the reason why we advocate for at least 1,000 is we think it's possible for any church of any size to be able to send out 10% of their church to help launch another location. And by send out, I'm hoping what you understand that to be, these are 100 people that already live in the community that you're wanting to move to, but they're coming from your original sending location. And so the great thing is, if you're able to send out 100 people like that, when you actually open the location, those 100 people, not only are they serving at the new location and engaging in leadership and discipleship responsibilities, they're also inviting their friends and family to join. And what we commonly see is that location will double the core size of the team. And so it'll be a couple hundred people from day one then at that new location. And what we've seen, of course, is if you can open a campus with 200 or more people, just the odds of long-term health and success for that new location, it just continues to go up. The healthier the launch, the healthier that church will be in the long run. And we've seen churches that have been smaller than 1,000 that have tried it. I don't know that I could name one, Sean, just to be honest, that had long-term health with their multi-site strategy. Maybe some of you know of some exceptions to that. And that's primarily the reason why we encourage churches to focus on getting to a little bit larger size before they move in this direction. But the good news is, I love the fact that part of the future vision is to continue to replicate, to continue to pursue other opportunities in your region, to continue to bring the mission of the local church to new people in your region. I love that vision. And actually, there are things you could be working on today to prepare for that future multiplication. So the vision itself is a good thing, and I love the heart behind that.
Yeah. So as more and more churches are going multi-site right now, we're working with and seeing more rural multi-site churches. Does the same principle apply for rural multi-site churches?
It really does. It really does. And I alluded in the conversation earlier to the church, and it's about as rural as you can get between Chicago and Indianapolis. Sean actually drove over because he lives in Indiana, so that we could hang out together for a little bit while I was serving this church. But it's a great church, and they have followed this principle. They grew their original location to 1,000 people in a very rural community in Indiana before they launched their next location, and they're already planning for their third location. But they want that second location that they just opened to actually be a little bit larger as far as the attendance is concerned, because they know they want to send out another team of people, a good sized core team, to launch that third location with success. And we've worked with, it's really all over the country, great rural multi-site churches in Iowa and North Georgia, several other locations around the country. And, the principles themselves, I think they really do work. I also think, Sean, just to be honest, rural churches have a little bit more opportunity here, because for churches like First Church in DeMont, Indiana, there's something so unique about the way they're doing church that I think people in these small communities, there aren't other opportunities like how they're doing church. And so it's really, it's what is it, blue ocean? I mean, no one else is doing this in these rural communities. And so the opportunity is huge.
Yeah, it is. I wanted to get to a question about governance when it comes to multi-site. We had a couple of these. Mike asked specifically, should there be one representative from each campus on the church board for the church as a whole? What does governance look like?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And we've seen churches try to do governance many different ways in multi-site models as well. Here's where I've seen, as far as governance is concerned, the way that you can maybe structure this part of your leadership so that it really does lead to unity and alignment. And that's to have one unified board that oversees all of the ministry of the church. And so no matter how many locations you are in, you have one unified team of lay leaders that's helping to protect the mission and the vision of the church going forward. And with that, we actually discourage multi-site churches from having representatives from each of the locations, because when we've seen churches kind of use that model in their governance, those representatives are really just thinking about the campus that they attend and that they're a part of, and they're not thinking about the overall health of the church. Sean, I mean, just to extend that a bit further, we've seen churches that have had separate, call them advisory teams or something along those lines for each location. And that also leads to a lot of division in the churches. And it's people are coming from a good place, but they're so focused on their location, their campus, that they're missing the opportunity to make sure we're protecting the overall health of the mission. So we can talk a little bit further, I guess, with churches as they engage with us about some of the specifics of what governance needs to look like in a multi-site model. But those are some of the basic principles that we hold to.
That's good. Tony, any final thoughts before we wrap up? Anything else you want to add to the end of our conversation?
We talked early in today's conversation just about the number of churches that are currently multi-site, especially churches that are 1,000 or more. What was even more shocking to me, back in December of last year, we did some research and collected some data. And what we found is over a third of churches that are 1,000 or more were planning to open a new location in 2023. So that's how quickly multi-site is continuing to expand. And Sean, as you know, we get the opportunity on almost a weekly basis to help another multi-site church in North America. And so if you're one of those churches that's thinking about opening a new location, whether you've been multi-site in the past or this is your first location, we would love to help you get on the front end of that planning to make sure that you are setting up your church and this new location for success, because we agree. We think multi-site, when done well, is a great way to continue to carry out the mission of the local church. And so if there's anything we can do to help you prepare for that new launch, please reach out to us.
Yeah. And if you do reach out, you're going to connect with either myself or Tony. You can email me directly. My name is Sean, SEAN at theunstuckgroup.com. You can do it that way. But we really hope today's content was helpful for you, whether you're considering going multi-site, maybe you're feeling multi-stuck right now. Maybe you're multi-site and super healthy, but you just want to sustain that health. Hopefully something in today's webinar was helpful for you in moving your strategy forward. But again, if we can help any way, reach out to us today. You can start a conversation at theunstuckgroup.com. Thank you for joining us. We'll see you again in the future on another webinar. Have a good day.